January 1842, and a column of 16,000 people, British soldiers, Indian sepoys, women and children, marches out from Kabul. Snow lies thick on the ground, the air is bitterly cold, and from the hills above comes the crack of rifle fire. Within a week, that entire column will be gone, their bodies scattered across the mountain passes of Afghanistan. And out of all of those thousands, just one European will ride into safety and into Victorian legend. The withdrawal of the British Army from Kabul turned into one of the biggest disasters to beset Queen Victoria's military during her long reign. It's a story of eye-watering losses, heroic bravery, personal feuds, and mind-bogglingly bad decisions played out in a country known as the graveyard of empires. But what was this army and its associated civilians doing in Afghanistan in the first place? It's a question that's been asked many times about many campaigns in Afghanistan by the British, the Americans, the Soviets and others. This particular disaster unfolded following the British invasion of Afghanistan in 1839, known as the First Anglo-Afghan War. The war wasn't born out of ambition, but rather out of anxiety. Specifically, the growing British paranoia about Russian expansion towards India, the jewel of her empire. This rivalry, later dubbed the Great Game, dominated British strategic thinking for decades. By the 1830s, Russia had been steadily pushing its frontier southward through Central Asia. In 1837, a Russian diplomatic mission arrived in Kabul to court the Afghan emir, Dost Mohammad Khan. Interestingly, Dost Mohammad had earlier in his reign actually sought British friendship and help recovering Peshawar from the Sikhs, but his overtures were rebuffed. The emir now received the Russians warmly, or at least too warmly for the British. Then the following year, Russian officers joined a Persian army besieging the British-aligned autonomous city of Herat in western Afghanistan. To British eyes in Calcutta and London, the Russian bear appeared to be marching towards India by way of Afghanistan and with the support of Dost Mohammad. Alarm bells started to ring. The British Governor-General of India, Lord Auckland, naturally a cautious man, was persuaded by his political secretary, William MacNaghtan, to embark on a policy of breathtaking miscalculation that would end in disaster. MacNaghtan argued that the best way to protect British interests and keep the Russians at bay was to ensure that Afghanistan was ruled by a pro-British monarch, and he had just the candidate, the former king, Shah Shuja Durrani. Shuja had been deposed in 1809 and ever since then he'd lived in gilded exile in British India. In the similar manifesto, issued in October 1838, Auckland accused Dost Mohammad of aggression and unprovoked hostility and declared the British intention to restore Shah Shuja. Both the description of the current ruler's hostility and the belief that Shuja would be welcomed bore little resemblance to reality. Even at the time, officers and officials in India questioned the premise. Sir Charles Metcalfe, a former Governor-General, wrote privately that the invasion was, quote, a piece of incredible folly. But MacNaghtan, who'd worked in the Indian civil service for 30 years and was an expert on local languages and law, felt he knew better. The force assembled for the invasion of Afghanistan with the purpose of removing Dost Mohammad and replacing him with the exiled former king was grandly titled the Army of the Indus. It was one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had yet assembled in Asia. The fighting strength was approximately 21,000 troops, but the total column, including camp followers, servants, merchants, families, animal handlers, was closer to 38 to 40,000 people. Don't forget that at this time, the British presence in India was actually represented by the East India Company, and it was the company that provided the bulk of the invading troops. Almost all of them were Indians, apart from the British officers. Nevertheless, several regular British Army regiments were also included in the Army of the Indus, namely the 13th Somerset Light Infantry, the 17th Regiment of Foot, the Leicestershires, and the 16th Lancers. Later on, they were to be joined by the 44th Regiment of Foot, who form a crucial part of our story later on. Also accompanying the invasion was a contingent of Afghan exiles loyal to Shah Shuja. The Army of the Indus was commanded by General Sir John Keane. The 58-year-old Keane hailed from Waterford in Ireland and had joined the army as a young teenager. A veteran of the Peninsular War, he had fought at the Battle of New Orleans where he had been injured in the groin. In March 1839, Keane's Army of the Indus crossed into Afghanistan from the southeast and, following a gruelling march, captured the city of Kandahar the following month. It was at Kandahar that Shah Shuja was formally restored to the throne in a ceremony attended by, well, very few Afghans. That lukewarm reception foreshadowed everything that was to follow, had anyone bothered to take any notice. Despite that unenthusiastic reception for the restored king, General Keane now advanced on the capital at Kabul. Blocking his route, however, was the formidable fortress city at Ghazni. Its walls were massive, and the British had left their siege artillery behind to lighten the column. Keane was now stuck in the middle of Afghanistan with the summer heat rising and no obvious way to take the mighty citadel. In the end, a nephew of Dost Mohammad defected and revealed that the Kabul gate was the weakest point and had not been bricked up like the others. And so on the 23rd of July, whilst under heavy fire, Lieutenant Henry Durand of the Bengal Engineers led a party that placed 300 pounds of gunpowder against the Kabul gate. The explosion blew the gate apart, and British and Indian troops poured through. In fierce hand-to-hand fighting, the fortress was captured with a loss of roughly 200 British and Indian troops either killed or wounded. Ghazni's fall shattered Dost Mohammad's prestige. His army began to melt away. The British entered Kabul on the 7th of August 1839, almost without resistance. Dost Mohammad fled northwards and eventually surrendered the following year and was packed off to exile in India. Meanwhile, Shah Shuja was installed as the emir. The campaign had achieved its aim of regime change. Yet, whilst General Keane headed home to a hero's welcome and a peerage, and troops were withdrawn to save money, the situation on the ground was far flimsier than it looked in the capital of British India, Calcutta, let alone thousands of miles away in London. As the Duke of Wellington observed, it was easy to get into Afghanistan, but a lot harder to get out. For a start, Shah Shuja was despised by most Afghans as a British puppet. Furthermore, his writ ran not much further than the areas which the British controlled, and even then it was far from solid. In a situation that rings bells with more recent periods, authority out in the countryside was fragmented between various warlords who continued their resistance both against the new regime and the British. In an effort to keep supply routes open to and from India, William MacNaghtan, who was now serving as Britain's chief political man in Afghanistan, resorted to paying tribal chiefs large subsidies. These worked, or at least they worked as long as the money kept flowing. Meanwhile, the British made a disastrous tactical error in Kabul, which ultimately would lead to disaster. The obvious place for the British garrison to be placed in the capital was the Bala Hissa, the ancient citadel perched on a rocky spur above the city, where Shah Shuja now resided. It commanded the surrounding terrain, had thick walls, and was, in the words of almost every military officer who examined it, the obvious place to place the British garrison. However, Shah Shuja, either because of a false sense of security or an attempt to prove he wasn't a British puppet, refused. General Keane's successor, General Cotton, initially opposed abandoning this strong point. However, despite being a general, he was subordinate to Britain's chief political envoy in the country, Sir William MacNaghtan. Just as he had persuaded Lord Auckland on regime change, he now pressurised General Cotton to vacate the mighty citadel in favour of a cantonment which was hurriedly constructed 2 miles to the north of Kabul. On low, flat ground, it was dominated by the surrounding hills. Its defensive walls were low, poorly constructed, and unable to resist a determined attack. The magazine, the ammunition and supply depot, was built outside the cantonment walls, a decision that was so inexplicable that later writers struggled to account for it. The commissariat fort containing the food supplies was also placed outside the perimeter. Of course, The camp, with several thousand British and British-trained sepoys inside, would probably have been okay as a garrison camp if Afghanistan had been pacified. But unfortunately it had not. The British were building up a disaster of their own making. But MacNaghtan's ill judgment did not end there. Throughout 1840 and 1841, as the situation deteriorated, MacNaghtan consistently sent optimistic reports to India. Tribal uprisings were minimised, the financial costs concealed, intelligence warnings dismissed. Based upon this rosy picture, in October 1841, Governor-General Lord Auckland cut the subsidies paid to those tribal chiefs who were keeping the eastern passes open. Also, based on his seemingly effective work in Afghanistan, he offered MacNaghtan the prestigious appointment of Governor of Bombay to begin early the following year, 1842. But William MacNaghtan would not live to take up that post. Almost immediately, the tribal chiefs closed the passes, and then just 3 weeks later, Kabul itself exploded into violence. Whilst MacNaghtan blithely believed that the situation was in hand, his deputy certainly didn't. Sir Alexander Burnes, who was now in his mid-30s, had travelled extensively in Central Asia over the previous 10 years, earning the nickname Bukhara Burnes. Unlike his boss, he had actually visited Kabul before the invasion and had a much more nuanced understanding of Afghan politics than MacNaghtan. He had previously recommended that Lord Auckland work with Dost Mohammad rather than replacing him. That advice was overruled by MacNaghtan. Burnes' resentment against his superior and a belief that, with his knowledge of the country, he should have been the British envoy, created a rift between the two men that got wider as the months went by. Indeed, feeling totally alienated by the whole situation, Burnes refused to live in the cantonment and instead took up residence in Kabul itself. There he made Afghan friends and moved relatively freely in Kabul society. And as he travelled the streets and talked to locals, he, unlike his superior, became increasingly pessimistic about the future. He sent intelligence warnings in late 1841 that something was afoot. As usual, MacNaghtan ignored him. On the morning of the 2nd of November, 1841, a mob gathered outside Burnes' house in the city. Burnes appeared on his balcony and attempted to reason with the crowd, reportedly offering money. He was shouted down. The house was stormed. Burnes and his brother Charles were hacked to death in the street. In the cantonment, both MacNaghtan and the new garrison commander, General Elphinstone, dithered. And so, no relief was sent to Burnes, and the chance to suppress the uprising at birth was lost. Swiftly the British lost control of Kabul, and soon afterwards Afghan sharpshooters effectively laid siege to the cantonment from the surrounding high ground. The British position in Kabul was rapidly becoming untenable. On the 23rd of December, the ever-confident MacNaghtan rode out to meet the charismatic and formidable son of Dost Mohammad, Akbar Khan, to negotiate a British withdrawal. What exactly happened is disputed. MacNaghtan may have been attempting to play a double game, secretly approaching one Afghan faction against the other. Akbar Khan apparently produced a written paper outlining just such a secret deal. In the confrontation that followed, MacNaghtan was seized, shot, and his body dragged through the Kabul bazaars. His limbs were displayed at the city gates. With Britain's senior man dead, the fate of the 4,000 British and Indian troops and their 12,000 camp followers was now in the hands of General Elphinstone. If ever there was a man less suited to this life or death situation, it was Major General William George Keith Elphinstone. Born in Scotland, he joined the army in 1804 and had fought at the Battle of Waterloo. And that had been the last time he'd seen active service, 26 years ago. He'd actually been placed on the retired list in 1837, but had been brought out of retirement by Lord Auckland to take over in Kabul. Now aged 59, suffering from severe gout and hardly able to mount a horse, Elphinstone had, in fairness, told Auckland he wasn't up for the task. But Auckland had insisted. And now a general, who was renowned for his indecisiveness, had to choose between two unpalatable options. Either he could hold out through the Afghan winter nearly 100 miles from the nearest friendly garrison in a defensive position that was poorly constructed, with the key supplies outside the walls and overlooked by the attacking Afghans. Or he could carry on where MacNaghtan had so disastrously failed and negotiate some form of deal with the Afghans, which would allow him to withdraw 16,000 people through the inhospitable winter terrain back towards India. Let's face it, if MacNaghtan's fate was anything to go by, then Afghan truces weren't very reliable, were they? In fact, even just going to a meeting to discuss a potential withdrawal had cost the British envoy his life. Caught between a rock and a hard place, Elphinstone decided on the second option. In exchange for safe passage out of the country for his entire army and camp followers, the British general agreed to surrender most of their artillery and vast quantities of stores, not to mention their dignity. The Afghans also promised that along with safe passage, the British column would be provided with food supplies too. Neither that safe passage or the food would ever materialise. Elphinstone was marching his whole army to their doom. And what about Shah Shuja? Well, he was left to his fate in Kabul. The British column that left the cantonment on the 6th of January 1842 comprised approximately 4,500 fighting troops and roughly 12,000 civilian camp followers, servants, merchants, wives and children of the Indian soldiers. The total column, therefore, numbered around 16,500 people. The fighting units comprised 3 regiments of Bengal infantry, plus the 5th Bengal Light Cavalry. There were also about 690 men from the British 44th Regiment of Foot. The 44th, the Essex Regiment, had been raised way back in 1741 and had served in various campaigns in North America, including the American Revolution and the War of 1812. They'd also fought in the Peninsular War and at Waterloo. They were commanded by Colonel John Shelton. Shelton was loathed by almost everyone who served near him, and the feeling was frequently mutual. His relationship with Elphinstone was one of barely concealed contempt, on both sides. Elphinstone found Shelton impossible to work with. Shelton found Elphinstone spineless and infuriating. But, thanks to seniority, Shelton was Elphinstone's number 2 in the column. Could things get any worse? Well, trust me, this was just the beginning. Elphinstone's destination was the British garrison at Jalalabad, just under 90 miles to the east. In theory, not a huge distance, until you factor in some of the most brutal terrain in Central Asia. In January, it is a landscape of ice, rock and deep snow. The road passes through several narrow gorges and high passes, where temperatures in January 1842 were reported well below -10 degrees centigrade, with some accounts suggesting night temperatures reached -20 degrees Celsius. The column, already encumbered by families and camp followers, moved at a crawl. Men without winter clothing, many of the Indian sepoys were completely unprepared for such cold, began dying within the first hours. Camp followers in thin cotton clothing were dying in their hundreds by the second day. Before the column had even cleared the immediate vicinity of Kabul, Afghan tribesmen began firing from the surrounding heights. So much for the promised safe passage. The first night, the column halted on open ground. There was no fuel, little food, and the temperatures plunged. Hundreds of camp followers froze to death during that very first night. Many soldiers were already too weak to actually fight effectively. 2 days later, on the 8th of January, the column entered the Khud Kabul Pass, a narrow defile roughly 5 miles long. Afghan Ghilzai warriors lined the cliffs above and poured fire into the column below. The troops in the pass had virtually no room to manoeuvre and almost no ability to return effective fire upward towards the hidden riflemen. By the time the column emerged from the pass, approximately 3,000 people had been killed or were missing. Further attacks came at Tizin and at the Jagjalak Pass, where a barrier of hollyoak bushes had been constructed across the road, forcing the survivors to fight through under intense fire. Throughout the retreat, Akbar Khan constantly demanded and received hostages. Presenting it as protective custody, it was also a very clever way of removing senior officers and their families from the column, thus whittling down its leadership and reducing its capacity to resist, whilst potentially bagging some very valuable bargaining chips for the future. Eventually, he would have 95 British hostages or prisoners in his possession. Amongst those hostages was Lady Sale, the wife of General Robert Sale, commanding at the column's destination at Jalalabad. Also taken into Akbar Khan's protection was the widowed wife of Sir William MacNaghtan. And then on the 11th of January, things managed to get even more chaotic. That day, Elphinstone, his second in command, Colonel Shelton, and another senior officer were invited to a meeting with Akbar Khan, ostensibly to negotiate safe passage, yet again. What exactly happened next remains shrouded in mystery and accusation. But the outcome was that the three men were taken into custody and never returned to the column. Some accounts suggest Elphinstone went voluntarily as a gesture of good faith to secure better terms for the column. Others suggest he was effectively lured and then told he wouldn't be returning. Whatever the precise circumstances, Elphinstone did not return, and the column, already leaderless in any practical sense, was now formally without a commander, and a deputy commander too. Any sense of order or fighting spirit departed the hungry, freezing cold, traumatised survivors. By the morning of the 13th of January 1842, the column had shrunk to less than 100 people. There were now more British being held hostage than struggling towards safety. That morning, the remaining 65 men of the 44th Regiment of Foot made their last stand on a rocky hillside near Gandamak. The hill at Gandamak is a bare rocky eminence offering little natural cover but some elevation above the surrounding ground. The men formed a rough perimeter on the rocky slopes, backs together, facing outwards. They had almost no ammunition left. And then the Afghans attacked. In close quarter fighting on the rocky hill, the 44th were destroyed almost to a man. Their most senior surviving officer, Captain Thomas Souter, made one of the most celebrated decisions of the entire disaster. Knowing that the regiment's colours could not be carried to safety and fearing their capture, he wrapped them around his body beneath his uniform. When the fighting ended, Souter was found alive. With the silk colours still wrapped around him, the Afghans apparently took him for a man of great importance and took him prisoner rather than killing him. 35 miles to the east lay the British garrison at Jalalabad. They were commanded by General Robert Sale, a very different commander to Elphinstone. Aggressive, physically brave to the point of recklessness, popular with his troops. He'd been wounded multiple times in his career, and he'd eventually be killed in action in India in 1845. Sale had been ordered towards Jalalabad with his brigade in October 1841 to keep the route to Kabul open. However, thanks to the cut in those subsidies, the local tribal leaders had effectively placed Sale and his garrison under siege. Despite that, Jalalabad was the safe, or relatively safe, refuge that Elphinstone's column was trying to reach. Now on the afternoon of the 13th of January, men of the garrison scanned the horizon. A solitary figure mounted on a pony was spotted. Assistant Surgeon William Brydon, serving with the Bengal Army, was one of a small number of horsemen who broke out from the fighting at Gandamak. All bar the surgeon had been overtaken and killed within a few miles. Brydon himself was wounded several times, including a sword cut to his head. His horse, already weakened, died beneath him, but he managed to grab hold of a pony as it galloped past. When asked by General Sale where the rest of the army was, he delivered the shocking reply, "I am the army." His forlorn arrival, slumped on his dying pony, bloodied and alone, was captured by Lady Elizabeth Butler in her painting entitled Remnants of an Army. Painted in 1879, it became one of the defining images of the Victorian age. It now hangs in Tate Britain. Despite the painting and the legend that it inspired, the truth was that Brydon was not the only survivor. A handful of other individuals, all Indians, struggled in over the next few days. And of course, the hostages, including the wounded Captain Souter, were still alive. But in terms of the fighting column that had left Kabul, the painting captures the enormity of the disaster to overtake the British Army in Afghanistan. An army of over 4,000 fighting men had been annihilated. Of the Bengal infantry battalions, almost no rank and file survived. The 44th Regiment of Foot had, apart from the captives, Captain Souter and Colonel Shelton, been wiped out. It's estimated that of the approximately 12,000 camp followers who left Kabul, only a few hundred survived. The news shocked the public back in Britain, but the Afghans hadn't finished with the British. They now set their sights on General Sale's command at Jalalabad. Maybe Dr. Brydon had simply jumped from the frying pan into the fire. Yet despite, or actually because, of the annihilation of the army retreating from Kabul, the British hadn't finished with the Afghans either. They started to gather another army to avenge the disaster. The Army of Retribution. I'm going to tell you about the Army of Retribution, along with fighting Bob Sale's heroic defence during the siege of Jalalabad, where he's ably assisted by one Harry Fleshman, or so the novel says, very soon, so watch out for that. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more stories from British history with you very soon.